Mike Black had everything most people spend their lives chasing. By the summer of 2020, the 30-something entrepreneur had built a successful company, lived in a comfortable home in Los Angeles, and enjoyed the kind of financial freedom that allowed him to travel, invest, and pursue passion projects. His software business was thriving, and his bank account comfortably padded. But beneath the surface of all that success, something was stirring, something restless. The world had just changed. COVID-19 had turned cities into ghost towns and dreams into ashes. Businesses were collapsing overnight. Jobs were disappearing by the millions. And even for someone like Mike, the devastation wasn't just a headline. It was personal. Friends, some of them fellow business owners, were calling him in tears. One had lost a $10 million business in less than a week. Another was sleeping in his car. It shook Mike to his core. Then came the question that started everything. What if I lost it all? That single thought wouldn't let go of him. He lay awake at night wondering, was his success purely the result of timing, privilege, and connections? Or could he build it all again? From scratch. Mike didn't want to just think about the answer. He wanted to live it. In July 2020, while the world was still figuring out how to survive a pandemic, Mike made a decision that would leave everyone who knew him stunned. He walked into his office, shut down his business, and transferred every dollar out of his personal accounts. Then he packed a single backpack. Inside, a change of clothes, a toothbrush, and a cell phone with no contacts, no wallet, no credit cards, no secret stash. And with that, Mike Black, the millionaire entrepreneur, became Mike Black, anonymous man with $0 to his name. He chose Denver, Colorado, as the place to begin. Why Denver? Because it was unfamiliar. He had no contacts there, no memories, no safety nets, just a city with strangers and the challenge of a lifetime. As he stepped off the bus that would drop him in the middle of downtown Denver, his heart was pounding. He looked around at the buildings, the buses, the faces passing by, and realized something for the first time. He was invisible. There was no press coverage, no crew, no fanfare. He was just another guy in old jeans and a hoodie. No one knew he once signed seven-figure deals. No one cared. The sun was setting. He had no home to go to, no food, no plan. Only a wild idea and a simple rule. If he could earn back $1 million in 12 months, starting from nothing, he would prove that resilience, hustle, and grit were more powerful than circumstances. But just hours into day one, standing in the middle of a city he didn't know, Mike began to realize something else. This wasn't going to be an experiment. This was going to be a war, and he had no idea what was coming next. The first night hit harder than Mike expected. Denver's streets were alive, but not in the way he'd known cities before. This wasn't a place of business meetings and rooftop cocktails. It was honking traffic, muffled shouts from shadowed alleys, and the chill of a concrete world that didn't care who you used to be. Mike wandered the downtown blocks with a small backpack slung over his shoulder. His million-dollar mindset clashed with the very real hunger beginning to gnaw at him. He'd had no food since that morning. And now, as darkness settled and the stores began to close, so did his access to anything familiar. Where do you sleep when you have nothing? He walked past shelters, already packed. He glanced at benches, each one either claimed or too exposed. Eventually, exhausted, he found a spot behind an industrial building, quiet, hidden, and just remote enough that no one would bother him. That first night, Mike curled up with nothing but his hoodie and the hard ground beneath him. The hum of passing cars filled his ears. He didn't sleep much. By sunrise, his joints ached and his stomach churned. He stood up slowly, brushing off dust, and realized something deep in his gut. This wasn't going to be uncomfortable. This was going to be brutal. But he hadn't come this far to retreat now. That morning, Mike found a public restroom to wash up, his reflection unfamiliar in the mirror. Then he pulled out his one asset, a smartphone with no contacts, no SIM, and only access to public Wi-Fi. It would become his lifeline. Day 2 was different. Tired but determined, Mike pulled together a plan. He logged on to Craigslist using a coffee shop's Wi-Fi and posted a simple ad. Willing to work. Can help with moving, deliveries, cleaning, organizing, or errands. Just need a place to crash. Honest, reliable, grateful. That was all he had to offer. His hands, his back, and his word. A few hours later, his phone buzzed. Someone had responded. A man named Jerry. Jerry wasn't offering a job, but he did have an old van parked in his backyard. He said Mike could crash there for a few nights, no strings attached. It wasn't glamorous. The van was dusty, smelled faintly of oil and mildew, and didn't lock properly. But to Mike, it felt like a penthouse suite. It was shelter. And with that shelter came a bit of mental space. He made a vow to himself right there inside the van. Tomorrow, I make money. And he did. The next morning, Mike scoured Craigslist's free section. He spotted a table someone was giving away. Nothing fancy, but clean and fixable. He messaged the owner, borrowed Jerry's help to pick it up, and posted it on Facebook Marketplace with a simple description and a clear photo. It sold that night. Profit, $50. It was a small amount, but the psychological win was massive. He went to bed in that van staring at the $50 in his hand like it was gold. Because it was. It meant this was possible. The next day, he repeated the process. A few free chairs, a beat-up shelf, a dusty but intact coffee table. By day 2, Mike had made about $250, bouncing between free listings, online marketplaces, and the streets of Denver, hustling with nothing but sweat, a phone, and some hard-earned persuasion. Meals were cheap, usually a can of beans or dry spaghetti bought from a dollar store. Every penny saved was a step closer to building something bigger. By day 5, he had enough cash to invest in a used laptop. It was old and slow, but functional. And with that purchase, Mike entered a new phase. He could now work remotely. He could type, research, market. He had tools. He had momentum. And most importantly, he had proof. With nothing but his own will, a broken laptop, and some Wi-Fi, he could create value. The question now wasn't if he could survive. The question was, how far could he really go? By the end of week 1, something had shifted. The man who had once closed six-figure deals in air-conditioned offices was now wheeling used chairs down sidewalks, his palms blistered, his hoodie soaked with sweat. But instead of shame, Mike felt something else stirring inside him. Pride. Not the flashy, ego-fueled kind, but the kind that comes from getting your hands dirty and knowing, deep down, you're building something real, something honest. The van Jerry had let him sleep in became more than just shelter. It became a launch pad. Each day, Mike followed a strict rhythm. Wake before sunrise, freshen up at a public restroom, scarf down a dollar store breakfast, and dive into the online world using free Wi-Fi from cafes or libraries. He was scanning Craigslist for free furniture, listing it on Facebook Marketplace, negotiating deals, coordinating pickups, delivering items, repeating. By day 5, with about $250 saved, Mike made a move that changed everything. He bought a used laptop. Not a shiny MacBook or a cutting-edge Ultrabook, just a clunky, beat-up device with a cracked screen and a stubborn battery. But to Mike, it might as well have been a golden key. With the laptop came options. Real ones. Now he wasn't limited to physical labor or flipping furniture. He could offer freelance marketing gigs, design basic websites, run small ad campaigns for local businesses, build a business plan, slowly but surely. But even with the laptop, there was still a catch. Where do you work when you're homeless? Public libraries had limits. Cafes expected you to buy something. And staying hunched over a laptop in a parked van? Not ideal. So, Mike looked for something most people wouldn't even consider: cheap co-working spaces. He found one, a scrappy spot downtown that offered shared desks for a modest daily fee. With the money he'd scraped together from furniture flips, Mike paid for a couple of days up front. No long-term commitment, just enough time to breathe and build. And it worked. Week 2 was electric. With a desk, internet, and laptop, Mike was like a storm unleashed. He'd spend 10 to 14 hours a day at that desk, switching between Craigslist flips and digital hustling. He reached out to small businesses offering to run their social media or design their ads, anything to bring in more income. He was always pitching, always moving, always learning. By the end of week 2, he had earned a few $1,000s in total revenue. It was happening. He was still sleeping rough part of the week, still stretching $5 into meals, still washing his clothes in sinks. But now, the bank balance was climbing. He began to think long-term: sustainability, systems, growth. With a few grand in hand, Mike took his next leap. He signed a lease on a tiny apartment. It wasn't much, just one room, barely furnished. But it had 4 walls, a door that locked, and a real bed. That night, when Mike lay down on a mattress instead of a van floor or public bench, he stared at the ceiling in silence. He wasn't a millionaire, he wasn't even comfortable yet, but he was no longer homeless. And just 3 weeks earlier, he had stepped off a bus with nothing. Now, he had a roof, a laptop, a growing side income, and an idea. Because somewhere between the late-night Craigslist flips and the early-morning instant noodles, something had sparked in his mind. What if I started a brand? Something I could scale? It was time to stop surviving and start building. But as he would soon learn, building is never smooth, especially when your past is gone and your future is riding on borrowed time. The apartment was small, but it was Mike's. For the first time since launching his million-dollar comeback, he had a key to his own front door. A bed, a microwave, a window that looked out onto the city that had tested him and, bit by bit, was now giving him a shot. There was no time to celebrate, because Mike wasn't just trying to survive anymore, he was trying to build. Flipping furniture had gotten him off the street, but it wasn't scalable, so he turned to what he knew best: business strategy, branding, and marketing. Using his laptop and his painfully slow Wi-Fi, he laid the foundation for a new company. Something that could grow, something that aligned with his values. Coffee. Not just any coffee, his own brand. One that was ethically sourced, one that gave back to animal shelters, one that told a story. The name, the packaging, the cause. The digital storefront, all born in that tiny apartment, often between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., as Mike ran on adrenaline, ramen, and a hunger far deeper than food. At the same time, he was pitching freelance marketing services to small businesses across the U.S. Startups needed visibility, and Mike had the skills to get them noticed. He landed a few clients, modest deals, but steady. He created content for them, managed social media pages, ran basic ad campaigns. By the end of month 2, Mike's revenue was climbing. He was lean, focused, and living on less than $10 a day. Everything he earned, he reinvested. The coffee business started to buzz. He connected with a roaster in Texas who could supply small batches. He built a website, created content, and ran his first test campaign. Sales trickled in. Then more. Then even more. By month 3, Mike had a home, a functioning business, and clients bringing in regular income. One night, filming a video in his kitchen, he smiled at the camera and said the words he had once only dreamed of saying: "3 months ago, I was homeless. And now, I've got a business, clients, and a place to live. It's crazy what can happen when you just don't give up. But success didn't mean peace. Because on a quiet afternoon in October 2020, Mike got the phone call that would shake the ground beneath him. His father had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Mike stared at the wall of his apartment in silence, phone pressed to his ear, mind reeling. They had always been close. His dad had supported him during his first ever business venture, had believed in him when others didn't, had told him, "You can always rebuild, no matter how far you fall." Now, he was the one falling. Mike didn't cry, not then. There was no time for that. Instead, he stared at the spreadsheet on his screen, then closed it. The challenge no longer felt like a project. It felt like a promise. He decided to dedicate the rest of the $1 million comeback to his father. He would keep pushing, keep building, not just to prove a point, but to make his dad proud, to show him what resilience really looked like. But while Mike buried himself in work, something else began to surface. His body was breaking down. The pain started in his joints, sharp, then dull, then constant. He thought it was from the stress, or maybe the long hours, but it didn't go away. The fatigue worsened. Some mornings, getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain. He ignored it, pushed through it, slept less, worked more. He didn't tell his audience. He didn't want pity. He wanted results. So Mike kept going, kept flipping, kept shipping coffee, kept closing small deals. From the outside, it looked like the comeback was accelerating, but on the inside, the weight was growing heavier by the day. And deep down, Mike knew something was coming, something that hustle alone couldn't fix. The days were getting longer, but Mike was getting slower. By the middle of month 5, the numbers on his spreadsheet looked promising. His online coffee business was slowly gaining traction. A few local retailers had started conversations. His freelance marketing clients were returning for more work. His bank account, once frozen at 0, now showed figures that made him proud. But Mike wasn't celebrating. Because behind the scenes, he was unraveling. The pain in his joints had evolved from annoying to unbearable. It started in his wrists, dull aches that throbbed after hours on the keyboard. Then his knees. Then his hips. Some days, getting out of bed was a victory in itself. He kept telling himself it was just fatigue, overwork, maybe even stress from the news about his dad. He pushed it down, hid it behind vlogs and smiles. But the truth was catching up. By month 6, Mike was seeing doctors in secret. He didn't share it with his audience, not yet. His project was built on grit and optimism. He didn't want sympathy. And maybe, deep down, he didn't want to admit to himself that something bigger might be wrong. The tests came back slowly. Blood work, scans, more blood work, more waiting. While his body faltered, his routine didn't. Mike worked 14 hours a day, managing orders, packaging coffee, editing videos, pitching clients, responding to customer emails, and troubleshooting late-night website glitches. Every dollar he made was a hard-won fight. Every task took twice the energy it had a month ago. By the start of month 7, the diagnosis was in. 2 autoimmune diseases were attacking his joints and muscles. And worse, a tumor had been discovered on his hip. The doctor's tone had been calm, but the weight of those words shattered Mike's mental shield. Suddenly, this wasn't about money anymore. This wasn't just a comeback story or a challenge to prove grit. This was his life, and it was changing whether he liked it or not. For the first time since day 1, Mike considered quitting. He sat alone in his apartment, laptop closed, head in his hands. He'd come so far. He had tens of thousands in earned revenue, a stable apartment, a growing audience, but his body was crumbling. His father was sick, and the deadline, the 1-year goal, still loomed like a giant in the distance. He opened his YouTube inbox. There were hundreds of messages, some encouragement, some business inquiries, and then one, buried between others, that stopped him cold. I was planning to take my life last week, but I found your channel, and I decided to wait one more day, then another, and now I'm still here. Because if you can go from the street to building all this, maybe I can try too. Thank you. Mike read the message twice. Then again. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, silent. This was why he started. Not for the $1 million, not even for himself, but to prove to anyone who felt hopeless, broken, stuck, that it was still possible to create something from the ashes. Even if he didn't reach the goal, even if his body refused to cooperate, even if the road was darker than he imagined, he couldn't stop now. That single message became his second wind. He replied with a short note, one he hoped that person would feel in their bones. You saved me too. From that day forward, Mike slowed down. But he didn't stop. He adjusted. He worked from bed. He limited his physical activity. He handed off a few tasks to freelancers. He took more rest days. But he kept building. He launched a subscription model for his coffee business, streamlined his freelance service, invested in digital ads to reduce manual outreach. The returns came slower, but steadier. By the end of month 9, Mike had earned just over $64,000. Not even close to $1 million, but far, far from zero. And more than he ever imagined possible under these circumstances. But the finish line wasn't just out of reach anymore. It was beginning to disappear. By month 10, Mike's body wasn't whispering for rest anymore. It was screaming. The nights were worse than the days. Pain twisted through his hips and legs like a slow burn, leaving him gasping awake at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, eyes bloodshot from fatigue. Even simple tasks, typing, standing, lifting a coffee box, took twice the time, 3 times the effort. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was the choice now pressing on him from both sides. Keep going and risk everything, or stop now and risk losing the point. The dream he'd started with, building a $1 million business from scratch in 12 months, was so close in spirit. But physically, it was drifting out of reach. His autoimmune diseases had worsened. The tumor in his hip made walking painful. His doctors had grown more direct. If you don't slow down, you could do permanent damage. Mike didn't flinch. He'd sacrificed everything, his comfort, his safety, his identity, to prove this experiment was real. That it wasn't some YouTube stunt. That grit meant something. And yet, the man who had defied so many odds was now watching his own body become the final obstacle. Still, he pushed. He kept recording, kept packaging coffee orders, kept building systems and tweaking marketing plans. But inside, something had shifted. The message from the fan, the one who said Mike's journey saved their life, had kept him going through month 9. But now, the weight of another life, the one back home, was growing heavier. His father. Mike had been keeping up with calls, checking in as best he could, never missing a chance to say, "I love you." But the prognosis had changed. His dad didn't have much time left. And for the first time since this all began, Mike stared at his camera, ready to record a new update. But no words came. He turned it off. He walked into his bedroom. And he cried. Not out of regret, not out of failure, but out of truth. Because the mission was never about the money. Not really. It was about proving that it could be done, that a comeback was always possible. And now, the greatest comeback he could make was to listen to the quiet voice saying, "Stop, be with your family, take care of your body." So in May 2021, 2 months shy of the 12-month finish line, Mike posted one final video. He sat at his desk, looking thinner, paler, worn, but clear-eyed. I have officially decided to end the project early. As much as it hurts me to do this, especially with just 2 months left, I feel like it's the right thing to do. He didn't cry, not on camera, but his voice cracked just enough to let people know the weight of it all. He spoke about his dad, about his health, about the long nights, the battles, the quiet moments most viewers never saw. Health and family come first, he said, eyes steady. And then he smiled. Not a performance, a peaceful, grounded smile. Because despite not reaching $1 million, he had rebuilt $65,000 from nothing, launched a business, changed lives, and perhaps most importantly, he walked away with something more valuable than profit: perspective. Mike signed off with a message that still echoes in the hearts of those who followed him. We laughed and cried together. We walked miles together and spent late nights in the office working super hard when no one else was watching. If nothing else, I hope you know now, it's possible to start over, even from zero. And then the screen faded to black. But for Mike, and for everyone watching, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the start of something even deeper. When the final video dropped in May 2021, Mike Black didn't expect a standing ovation. He expected silence. A few heartfelt messages, maybe, some disappointed followers, the inevitable fade-out of internet attention. That would have made sense. After all, he hadn't hit the $1 million mark. He didn't even finish the full year. The story, by traditional standards, was incomplete. But that's not what happened. Instead, something strange and unexpected took hold. The story spread. Not right away, not viral overnight, but slowly, organically, quietly. Clips from his YouTube series were shared in entrepreneurial groups. A startup founder cited his $0 to $65,000 journey in a conference speech. A student wrote about him in a college essay on resilience. A single Twitter thread about his project in 2024 exploded. Millions of views, thousands of retweets, and suddenly people were asking, wait, who's this guy who lived like he was homeless just to prove you can rebuild? Some praised him, loudly. They called him brave, gritty, inspirational. They saw in his story what they needed at that moment: hope with scars. Others fired back just as loudly. They said it was privileged, tone-deaf, a stunt. They argued that real homelessness wasn't an experiment, that Mike still had knowledge, strength, and an out. Things the truly destitute don't. Mike didn't run from the debate. He leaned in. He made it clear. This was never meant to romanticize homelessness. It was about his limits, not a blueprint for the broken system. I wasn't trying to say, anyone can do this. I was trying to say, maybe I still can. He acknowledged the criticism, publicly, privately, on podcasts, in interviews, but he never let it drown out the real heart of the project, showing that even when the world strips everything from you, your next move still matters. And for thousands of people around the world, that was the message they clung to. People who had lost jobs in the pandemic. People who had left bad relationships with nothing but a bag. People who had hit rock bottom and wondered if starting over was just a fantasy. Mike proved it wasn't. He didn't tell them to hustle harder or dream bigger. He told them to start small. Sell a table. Take the odd job. Eat beans if you have to. Stack little wins until the tide shifts. By late 2021, Mike had returned to a quieter life, still running businesses, still managing his health, still caring for his dad. The experiment had ended, but the movement hadn't. He launched workshops teaching ethical entrepreneurship, shared resources for mental health, financial literacy, and beginner business tips. He stopped obsessing over his YouTube numbers and focused more on what the comments actually said. And they said things like, "I started my Etsy shop because of you. I finally left that toxic job. I didn't give up this week." The story, it turned out, didn't need $1 million to be complete. It needed honesty, struggle, truth, and someone willing to walk through fire with a camera rolling. Not to show off, but to say, "It's hell, but here's proof you can move through it." Today, Mike Black rarely talks about the $1 million goal. What he talks about is something bigger. What it costs to change your life. What it takes to rebuild.